Trace your finger along the map of the Atlantic in the year 1722 and follow the trade winds sweeping southward past the Azores toward the coast of West Africa, where humid air carries the smell of salt, rotting oak, lamp oil, and human sweat across crowded harbors packed with merchantmen waiting nervously for convoy protection. Here, the snapping canvas of square-rigged sails, straining beneath heavy wind while rigging creaks through tar-blackened deadeyes and hemp shrouds slick with seawater. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a pirate flagship cuts through dark swells under full sail, its hull freshly careened and coated in pitch. Its gun ports open like black wounds above the waterline. Men aboard merchant vessels whisper one name with genuine terror: Bartholomew Roberts. Blackbeard, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age of Piracy, a commander who captured more than 400 ships between 1719 and 1722 and transformed the Atlantic into a floating battlefield ruled by fear. Yet Roberts himself would eventually become part of one of the most horrifying execution spectacles in maritime history, an event so massive and brutal that witnesses described it as less a legal punishment and more a ritual warning designed to terrify an entire oceanic world. To understand why the execution became legendary, it is necessary to understand the scale of piracy during the early 18th century. European empires depended upon fragile maritime arteries transporting sugar, silver, tobacco, enslaved Africans, spices, and textiles across thousands of miles of open sea. Merchant vessels displaced between 150 and 500 tons burthen carried enormous cargoes packed beneath decks reinforced by oak futtocks and transverse beams, fastened together with iron spikes hand-forged inside dockyard furnaces. These ships relied on bronze culverins and iron demi-cannon mounted behind gun ports cut into the tumble-home hull. Artillery capable of firing solid iron round shot weighing between 6 and 18 pounds, using black powder mixtures composed of roughly 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. Once ignited through touch holes by linstocks or flintlock firing mechanisms, the powder generated rapidly expanding gases reaching temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, launching cannonballs through enemy hulls with enough force to shatter oak planking into clouds of splinters sharper than knives. Maritime combat therefore resembled industrialized dismemberment, fought atop floating wooden fortresses soaked in tar and gunpowder residue. Roberts mastered this environment perfectly. Born in Wales around 1682, he originally served as a merchant sailor before capture by pirates near the African coast forced him into outlaw life. Unlike many drunken and disorganized buccaneers, Roberts maintained strict discipline aboard his vessels. His articles of agreement prohibited gambling aboard ship and required lights extinguished by 8 o'clock in the evening to reduce fire hazards inside powder-heavy environments. Sailors violating discipline faced whipping or marooning. Yet despite this structure, Roberts cultivated terrifying symbolism deliberately. He dressed in crimson damask waistcoats, trimmed with gold chain necklaces while carrying pistols mounted in silver. Witnesses described him standing upon quarterdecks during battle beneath black flags depicting skeletons and bleeding hearts while cannon smoke rolled around him through tropical wind. Roberts understood that spectacle itself could become weaponized. Merchant captains often surrendered immediately once recognizing his sails because resistance meant slaughter. Pirate ships under his command mounted dozens of guns, including bronze sakers and iron 9-pounders capable of reducing merchant hulls into drifting wreckage within minutes. Cannon recoil slammed carriages backward across deck planking slick with seawater, while gun crews swabbed barrels between shots using wet wool mops to extinguish lingering embers before fresh powder charges entered the bore. One mistake could ignite the entire deck. Powder monkeys carrying cartridges wrapped in coarse linen moved through sulfur smoke thick enough to blind and suffocate men during combat. Roberts operated within this lethal world for years until February 10th, 1722, when destiny closed around him off Cape Lopez near modern Gabon. British warship HMS Swallow under Captain Challoner Ogle finally cornered the pirate fleet after months of pursuit across Atlantic trade routes. What followed ended not merely in battle, but in an execution campaign so massive and terrifying, it became one of the clearest examples of empire using death itself as propaganda. The final battle against Bartholomew Roberts began beneath gray morning skies rolling above the Gulf of Guinea while humid wind carried the smell of salt water and rotting vegetation from the African coastline. Roberts commanded the Royal Fortune, a heavily armed pirate vessel displacing approximately 400 tons and mounting nearly 40 cannon distributed across reinforced gun decks lined with spare rigging, powder barrels, and boarding weapons. The ship itself represented years of accumulated plunder and naval expertise. Its hull had been repeatedly repaired using captured timber scavenged from merchantmen, while additional futtocks reinforced the frame against recoil stress generated by broadside fire. Roberts believed HMS Swallow posed little threat initially because pirate lookouts mistakenly identified the approaching warship as a fleeing merchant vessel. That error proved fatal. As the British ship closed distance, gun ports suddenly opened along its side, revealing rows of iron cannon already loaded with round shot and grape shot. Naval gunners trained through endless drill routines moved with mechanical precision. Powder charges measured carefully according to barrel caliber disappeared into muzzles, followed by wadding, iron projectiles, and final tamping using ramrods nearly 8 feet long. At the command to fire, linstocks touched powder priming inside the touch holes. The chemical reaction exploded instantly. Saltpeter released oxygen feeding rapid combustion while sulfur lowered ignition temperature and charcoal provided fuel. Gas pressure hurled cannonballs outward with terrifying velocity. The first broadside tore across the Royal Fortune like a hurricane of iron. Round shots smashed through oak planking nearly 2 feet thick, transforming shattered wood into lethal splinters that sliced through flesh, arteries, and bone simultaneously. Grape shot consisting of clustered iron balls packed inside canvas bags spread outward like giant shotgun blasts, shredding exposed sailors across the deck. Roberts himself stood dressed in crimson beside the mizzenmast when grape shot struck his throat. Witnesses described him collapsing almost instantly while blood soaked the elaborate fabric of his coat. Pirate crews, terrified British sailors might capture and publicly display their captain's corpse, obeyed Roberts's earlier instructions immediately. They wrapped his body in sailcloth and threw it overboard into Atlantic waters blackened by powder smoke. The seas swallowed him within seconds. Yet death did not end the horror surrounding Roberts's downfall. More than 270 pirates survived capture after the battle. These prisoners became subjects of one of the largest pirate trials ever conducted. Transported in chains to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, they endured confinement inside stone dungeons already infamous for heat, disease, and overcrowding. The castle itself overlooked crashing Atlantic surf from massive whitewashed walls armed with iron cannon pointed toward the harbor approaches. Inside, prisoners suffocated beneath tropical humidity while rats crawled across mold-covered floors contaminated by sewage and stagnant water. Iron shackles rubbed flesh raw around wrists and ankles during weeks of confinement. Dysentery spread rapidly through the cells. Mosquitoes carrying malaria fed constantly on exhausted prisoners too weak to brush them away. British authorities intended more than legal punishment. They intended spectacle. Piracy threatened Atlantic commerce worth millions of pounds annually. Merchant insurance costs soared whenever pirate activity intensified. Slave ships, sugar convoys, and East India merchantmen required expensive escorts. Public execution therefore became political theater designed to restore imperial confidence. The trials began during March 1722. Court officials wearing powdered wigs and dark robes questioned prisoners beneath sweltering heat, while armed guards lined the chamber carrying muskets fitted with triangular bayonets capable of punching through ribs and organs with horrifying efficiency. Many pirates defended themselves by claiming forced recruitment after capture at sea. Others insisted they served unwillingly under Roberts, but the court sought examples rather than nuance. Death sentences emerged rapidly. 32 pirates received execution orders by hanging. Others were sentenced to transportation, forced labor, or whipping. Yet it was the execution itself that transformed the event into maritime legend. On the morning chosen for execution, condemned pirates were marched from Cape Coast Castle toward the gallows beneath blazing equatorial sunlight, while crowds gathered along the shoreline to witness imperial justice transformed into public spectacle. The prisoners wore chains linking wrists and ankles together so tightly that iron rubbed skin raw with every step. Some had already deteriorated physically from months inside overcrowded dungeons where disease and malnutrition hollowed faces and loosened teeth inside swollen gums. Tropical heat intensified the smell surrounding the procession. Sweat, sewage, salt water, mildew, blood, and decaying food drifting together through humid air thick enough to taste. British soldiers armed with flintlock muskets marched alongside the condemned, while drummers beat slow rhythms echoing against the stone walls of the fortress. The gallows themselves stood deliberately visible beside the harbor approaches, so arriving merchant crews would see pirate corpses swinging above the coastline long before anchoring offshore. Construction crews built the structure from thick timber beams reinforced by iron bolts hammered through the joints. Multiple nooses hung from the crossbeam because authorities intended mass execution rather than individual ceremony. Rope quality mattered enormously during 18th century hangings. Hemp fibers twisted into execution nooses needed sufficient strength to support body weight without snapping while remaining rough enough to tighten rapidly around the neck beneath downward force. Unlike later long drop methods designed to break the neck quickly, early 18th century hangings often relied upon slow strangulation. Victims convulsed for several minutes as oxygen deprivation and carotid artery compression triggered unconsciousness gradually. Witnesses described condemned pirates praying, cursing, vomiting, or staring silently toward the sea during final moments. Some attempted bravado, shouting insults toward officials or laughing bitterly beside the scaffold. Others collapsed physically before reaching the platform and required dragging by guards. Once positioned beneath the nooses, prisoners stood atop carts or wooden supports, removed simultaneously upon command. Bodies dropped only short distances, causing ropes to snap taut violently against throats without immediately breaking cervical vertebrae. Legs kicked desperately. Fingers clawed at nooses tightening beneath body weight. Faces darkened as blood flow failed. The process could last several agonizing minutes depending upon rope placement and individual body mass. Yet even death itself did not conclude the punishment. British authorities understood decomposition possessed psychological value. Pirate corpses were left hanging publicly after execution, so sailors approaching the harbor would witness the consequences of rebellion and maritime theft. Tropical conditions accelerated decay rapidly. Heat bloated bodies within days, while flies laid eggs inside mouths, eyes, and open wounds. Seabirds tore at exposed flesh. Limbs blackened beneath sun exposure and bacterial growth. Some corpses were later coated in tar and placed inside iron gibbet cages suspended beside busy shipping lanes. Tar slowed decomposition slightly while protecting remains from complete skeletal collapse. Gibbeting represented one of the most feared post-mortem punishments in maritime culture because it transformed human bodies into long-term warnings visible for months or even years. Ships sailing past harbor entrances saw skeletons rattling inside rusting cages whenever wind shifted from the sea. The execution of Roberts's crew achieved precisely the effect British authorities intended. Merchant captains described renewed confidence in Atlantic trade routes afterward, while newspapers across Europe published vivid accounts of the hangings. Yet among sailors, the spectacle generated mixed reactions. Many understood pirate brutality intimately, but they also recognized how easily ordinary seamen could drift into outlaw life through impressment, unpaid wages, or abusive captains. Pirate crews often included former naval sailors, escaped slaves, indentured servants, and merchant mariners driven toward rebellion by desperation. The execution therefore carried an uncomfortable message extending beyond piracy itself. Empire would maintain maritime order through overwhelming violence whenever necessary. And nowhere was that violence displayed more clearly than in the slow public deaths of captured pirates swinging above the Atlantic surf. Although the mass hanging after Roberts's defeat became one of the largest pirate executions ever recorded, another death from the same era gained terrifying notoriety for entirely different reasons. In November 1701, the infamous Captain William Kidd stood trial in London after years of political scandals surrounding accusations of piracy and murder. Kidd originally sailed under legitimate letters of marque authorizing attacks against French shipping and hostile privateers in the Indian Ocean. Wealthy investors, including powerful English nobles, financed his expedition expecting profitable returns from captured enemy cargoes. But the voyage collapsed into mutiny, disease, and legal disaster after Kidd seized vessels under disputed circumstances while struggling to control increasingly desperate crews. By the time he returned seeking pardon, political winds had shifted against him completely. Kidd's execution became terrifying not because of mass casualties, but because of its grotesque physical failure. On May 23, 1701, crowds gathered at Execution Dock along the River Thames, a location reserved specifically for maritime criminals. The dock itself smelled of tidal mud, sewage, rotting fish, and coal smoke drifting from London's crowded waterfront. Thousands of spectators packed the shoreline and nearby boats, hoping to witness the downfall of the once famous privateer. Kidd wore respectable clothing and reportedly attempted calm dignity during his final speech, insisting repeatedly upon his innocence regarding piracy charges. The executioner placed a hemp noose around Kidd's neck while sailors, merchants, laborers, and aristocrats watched from every direction. Then the hanging began, but the rope snapped. Instead of dying instantly or even entering strangulation, Kidd crashed violently onto the dock below before horrified spectators. Panic rippled through the crowd. Some interpreted the broken rope as divine intervention, believing God himself rejected the execution. Others shouted for continuation immediately. Authorities refused mercy. A second rope was prepared while Kidd, injured and terrified, climbed once more toward the scaffold knowing exactly what awaited him. This time the hanging succeeded. Kidd strangled slowly before the crowd, while tides moved beneath the dock pilings and gulls circled overhead through smoke-filled London air. Yet the punishment still did not end. Kidd's corpse was coated in tar and suspended inside an iron gibbet cage beside the Thames for approximately 3 years. The cage creaked in river wind while ships entering London passed directly beneath the decaying remains. Rain darkened exposed bone. Seabirds nested around the structure. The smell during summer months reportedly carried across nearby wharves as decomposition advanced beneath the tar coating. Authorities intended the display to terrify sailors contemplating piracy, and it worked. Maritime culture during the 18th century revolved around visible examples. Public punishment reinforced imperial authority in environments where law often felt distant or fragile. Pirate executions therefore became carefully staged performances, blending legal procedure, religious symbolism, and raw intimidation. Execution. Dock itself operated according to ritual. Condemned pirates were transported along the Thames, accompanied by marshals, while crowds mocked or prayed depending upon personal sympathies. Clergymen offered final sermons emphasizing repentance and obedience. Once hanged, bodies remained suspended until at least 3 tides washed over them, symbolically cleansing maritime crime through the river itself. Only afterward could further post-mortem punishments occur. These rituals mattered because piracy represented more than theft. It threatened the economic bloodstream of empire. Sugar plantations, slave trading companies, East India merchants, and colonial governments all depended upon stable shipping routes. Every pirate attack increased insurance costs, delayed cargoes, and undermined investor confidence. Execution therefore became economic theater designed to reassure merchants while terrifying sailors. Yet for ordinary seamen watching friends rot inside gibbets beside the Thames or Gold Coast harbors, the message remained brutally personal: obedience or annihilation. The sea offered wealth and freedom briefly, but imperial justice waited patiently at the end of the voyage. Pirate executions became especially horrifying because maritime punishment exploited the human body long after death itself occurred. Gibbeting transformed corpses into permanent warnings visible from enormous distances. Iron cages, custom-built by blacksmiths, surrounded bodies tightly enough to prevent complete collapse during decomposition, while still exposing flesh to weather, insects, and scavenging birds. Chains anchored the structures to tall posts overlooking harbor entrances, riverbanks, or busy sea channels. In hot climates, bodies decayed rapidly beneath sun exposure, swelling with internal gas before skin split apart, releasing fluids down rusted iron bars. In colder regions, decomposition slowed, preserving recognizable facial features for months. Sailors approaching major ports often identified executed pirates long before docking because skeletal remains swung visibly against the skyline. The psychological effect proved immense. Many mariners described nightmares after passing gibbeted bodies creaking in coastal wind. Children growing up near execution sites reportedly memorized the shapes of hanging skeletons against sunset skies. Maritime authorities understood this fear intimately and cultivated it deliberately. Even the technology of execution reflected industrial precision. Ropes intended for hangings were constructed from tightly braided hemp fibers treated to resist moisture and fraying. Improper rope diameter risked decapitation during drops or failure beneath body weight. Gallows beams required careful engineering because multiple simultaneous executions generated tremendous downward stress against support structures. Executioners themselves occupied strange social positions, balancing public necessity with widespread disgust. Some drank heavily before carrying out duties, while others developed reputations for cruelty or incompetence. A poorly tied knot could prolong strangulation horribly. Witnesses described condemned pirates convulsing for 10 minutes or more, while crowds watched in horrified fascination. During mass executions after Roberts's defeat, authorities coordinated hangings carefully to maximize visibility from anchored ships offshore. Merchant captains entering harbor therefore witnessed pirate bodies swaying above the coastline before unloading cargo. Yet despite these terrifying displays, piracy continued for decades afterward because maritime suffering existed everywhere across the Atlantic world. Naval impressment gangs kidnapped sailors from docks and taverns, forcing them into brutal service aboard warships where floggings with cat-o'-nine tails shredded flesh down to exposed vertebrae. Merchant crews endured starvation wages, spoiled food, and captains enforcing discipline through beatings. Slave ships crossing the Atlantic packed human beings into holds, with mortality rates sometimes exceeding 20% during long voyages. Against this backdrop, piracy occasionally appeared attractive despite obvious risks. Pirate articles of agreement often promised equal voting rights, injury compensation, and loot shares unavailable aboard legitimate vessels. This contradiction haunted imperial authorities. They needed executions spectacular enough to outweigh the perceived freedoms piracy offered desperate sailors. Fear, therefore, became policy. The death of Black Bart's crew at Cape Coast Castle and William Kidd's gibbeted corpse beside the Thames represented not isolated punishments, but components within a larger strategy of maritime control. Empires governed oceans through commerce, cannon fire, and terror simultaneously. Every execution reminded sailors that the state possessed power not only to kill, but to erase dignity completely afterward. Imagine approaching London by ship during the early 18th century, while fog drifts across the Thames, carrying coal smoke and sewage odors from the city. Suddenly, above the riverbank appears an iron cage containing human remains coated black with tar, bones rattling softly whenever wind shifts through the harbor. Nearby sailors lower their voices instinctively. No speech is necessary. Everyone understands the message immediately. That silent terror made pirate executions unforgettable long after the bodies themselves vanished into dust and rust. The most terrifying pirate execution ever recorded was horrifying not because of one dramatic moment, but because it revealed the full machinery of maritime fear operating across the Atlantic world. Whether watching dozens of Roberts's pirates strangling slowly beneath the tropical sun at Cape Coast Castle, or witnessing William Kidd's failed hanging followed by years suspended inside an iron gibbet above the Thames, contemporaries understood these deaths were designed as warnings visible across oceans. Execution became theater. Corpses became symbols. The sea itself became courtroom, prison, and grave simultaneously. Imagine standing aboard a merchant vessel entering harbor sometime during the early 18th century, after months crossing storm-filled Atlantic routes. Your sails hang damp with salt. The hull creaks beneath wave pressure while exhausted sailors haul lines through blistered hands blackened by tar and powder residue. Then someone points toward shore. Hanging above the coastline are human remains twisting slowly in the wind. The body no longer resembles a person completely. Skin darkened beneath weather exposure clings to exposed bone, while seabirds circle nearby, waiting for scraps loosened by decay. Iron bars creak softly around the corpse whenever harbor gusts rise from the water. Everyone aboard falls silent, because every sailor understands the meaning instantly. This is what awaits pirates. This is what awaits mutiny. This is what empire does to those who threaten the trade routes carrying sugar, silver, tobacco, slaves, silk, and gold across the oceans. Pirate executions terrified entire generations because they extended punishment beyond death itself. Hanging alone killed the body. Gibbeting destroyed memory, dignity, and identity afterward. Families rarely recovered remains for burial. Friends avoided speaking names publicly for fear of association. The condemned simply rotted above harbors until storms scattered bones into sea or mud. Yet the deeper horror lies elsewhere. Many executed pirates had once been ordinary sailors trapped inside brutal maritime systems already saturated with violence. They emerged from naval floggings, starvation wages, disease-ridden voyages, and merchant hierarchies maintained through fear. Piracy promised freedom briefly, but imperial justice answered with terror on an even greater scale. And so the Atlantic during the Golden Age of Piracy became a world where every horizon carried warning signs. The smell of rotting oak and sulfur drifted across crowded ports. Cannon smoke rolled above black water during boarding battles fought with cutlass and pistol at arm's length. Merchant crews stared nervously toward distant sails, wondering whether they approached salvation or slaughter. And above harbors from London to the Gold Coast, the dead swung endlessly in chains while the sea wind whispered through their bones.